Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants of this fifth forum of the Right to Water and Right to Hope cycle. It is interesting to share with you this new meeting that pushes the continuity of a project that started in July and that has addressed the challenges since the dialogue point of view, and that we should be able to think together how to build this special pathway, this specific special world times in light of all the challenges that are worth fighting for. Today we're going to be talking about new paradigms in environmental right, a new covenant between the humanity and the planet, and how important this issue is. Some critics might think that it is a bit naive, but when we take a look at the global snapshot, we see critical situations regarding vulnerability and poverty and the climate change. That fiery map in the Latin American continent is seen as a large bonfire that only burns or kills the man and the planet. This reminds us of our commitment to take care of our own planet. The environmental right issue has been addressed from the very beginning when Dr. Lorenzetti talked about this issue with Dr. Batimo. We should think about the health of the world and the man. And this opens up the opportunity to think about specific challenges and the capacity to exchange knowledge for the sake of coming up with proposals. Perhaps we might have more certainties about the diagnosis, but we should be brave to address proposals and go further. We should be able to put them in motion, to set proposals in motion, and that involves the agreement of all sectors, public policies, community sectors, companies, civil society entities and universities, and trade unions. It's not just about living in naive harmony, but to live in a proactive society for the common good, that is to take care of the common house. We always want to thank the people supporting us, the University of San Antonio de Areco, National University of the Northeast of the Province of Buenos Aires, the National University of Rosario, the Secretariat of University Policies, UN Policies for Social Projects, and the Sanitation Workers Association for Development in the framework of their university framework. This is the year of the creation of this University Institute of Water and Sanitation, where we are invited to participate and make it grow. I'd like to tell you that this forum is being broadcast on a YouTube channel, and at this time it's also broadcast on the radio in the radio station 18.8.1, based on the program called Buen Ambiente that has broadcast all of the fora. Now we'll give the floor to Gabriela so that she introduces this forum and also addresses the technical issues that we always address. Thank you very much, and let us enjoy this forum. Thank you, Luis. Welcome you all to the 5th International Forum. Today we have 7 speakers. As Luis stated before, Dr. Hugo Matei, that has been working at the Institute since 2017 and has been with us at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in the seminar of Right to Water, let us know that he had to travel urgently due to a family problem, so he will not be able to join us. After each panel in which the speakers will be making their 10-minute presentation, there will be a room for Q&A, a 10-minute Q&A section that is open both to speakers so they can exchange opinions, and also opinions and questions raised by the participants. This is the idea in this forum, the dialogue for the building of solutions. These questions and answers are made through the Q&A tool that is shown in most devices at the bottom part of the devices. I want to remind all participants that we'll be taking questions received in the Q&A section so we can better organize dialogue. As regards speakers, today we'll be hearing from Marcelo Sanchez Orondo, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, who has guided us in the Vatican in this pathway, supporting Pope Francis. Marcelo is a friend, a source of inspiration, has strongly pushed the work performed by the Academy on climate change and its devastating effects. Then we will hear from Kate Rowe, Director of Studies at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purposes at University College London, from the University College London. This institute was founded by Mariana Mazzucato, who referred to us to Kate Rowe, and I have heard outstanding comments regarding her work. Then we'll hear from Diane Desierto, human and civil rights teacher at the Klaus Center for Human and Civil Rights of the University of Notre Dame in the United States. We hope we will be able to listen to her this time because in the last forum we had some technical inconveniences. The first channel will finish with Enrique Crespo's presentation. He's the president of the ENOSA, National Entity of Waterworks for Sanitation in Argentina. After the Q&A section, the second panel, we will hear from Joan Acceso, researcher at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment in the United Kingdom. She's the director of the climate change litigation processes. I want to thank Joanna for having interrupted her vacation to take part in this forum. Then we will hear from Gabriel Eckstein. He's the director of the Energy, Environmental, and Natural Resource Systems Law Program, Texas A&M University at the United States. And he was with us at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences back in 2017. And we have been in contact ever since. And Josiane Gauthier will be closing the panel. She's Secretary General of the CITSE, based in Belgium, and she's one of the experts invited to the Amazon Synod last year in October. Without further ado, I would like to thank all the speakers that are here with us today and all the participants in this forum. Some of you have been with us since the first forum, and I'm always open to dialogue. As usual, there are some technical or organizational issues to be addressed. I will be repeating during the forum. There is simultaneous translation in this forum. Each one of you can choose the language in which you will be listening to the presentation, Spanish or English. It's important that when you take the floor, you should choose the channel in which you will speak in. This choice is usually available at your devices at the bottom part thereof, the right part where it says interpretation or interpretación. And speakers are kindly asked to remember that if you have some external microphones, please speak into the microphone when speaking so that the interpreter's work would be made easier. While presentations are being made in each panel, you can write your questions in the Q&A section so we can ask them to the speaker. It's important that those of you who are not speakers have to remember that we will only take those questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat box, which is usually on the right. The chat section is a non-moderated area where you can introduce yourselves and you can tell us who you are and where you come from. So we will start with the first panel. Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez Orondo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for having me here to this major panel on a key issue. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to see Luis and Gabriela and the other friends whom I have met here. I would like to take this opportunity to address an issue which I always highlight because it's a scientific issue. Water has been declared a common good, which means that it's a common good for all humankind in the planet. Because we know that we have this common good, water, in the planet. In some other areas, this is not known. And naturally, water, as you all know, is a source for life. As philosophers used to say, they used to say that water was the principal core for everything, the foundation. They had not yet understood the importance that water has. As the Academy has always insisted on this issue, since I took off, as I became Chancellor, I have heard that this issue has been addressed before. Today, water issue and justice with water is a production problem, a water production problem. And then we have that problem of distribution. Just like food, first we have to produce food and then distribute it. And today, water production is affected by the so-called climate change. This is the paramount thesis of the Academy that has been repeated by our climate experts, by Ramanathan, who comes from the India, Crutzen from the Netherlands, Molina from Mexico, that is from all parts of the world. And luckily, this thesis that I have heard for more than 20 years in the Academy has been fully adopted by the Laudato Si and by the documents that we have created. We created in our meeting in February 2017, that is to say 3 years and a half ago. The first thing that is said there, the use of fossil material, whether it be petroleum or coal or energy, are destroying the climate, are bringing about the climate change, which is a delicate way of telling the truth. They are bringing about a global warming. That is what ruins the life cycle, that is the water cycle. So the more the warming it is, the less water we have. And this is devastating. So the first issue, even before the distribution of water as a good for everyone, because it's a public good, we have the issue of conservation or production. We don't produce water, in fact, but we create the conditions so that water can exist. By destroying, if we destroy the climate, we destroy the conditions for water production. So what the Academy has been saying for more than 20 years, now in the last World Report on the Development of Water Resources 2020, focuses on this issue, water and global warming. The idea is to say not only that there is a close relationship, but also to say that if we don't bring about a change, if we don't reduce the carbon dioxide produced by petroleum and coal that is used primarily for energy purposes, for everything that involves production, all the economy is based on these principles. We are going to continue devastating or destroying the water cycle, and at the end of the day, we would be damaging the water distribution. Therefore, what are the solutions? The first large-scale solution is to try to change the misuse of energy with fossil material. And this is what all nations are requesting, and it was done in the COP21 conference in Paris. And this is what, unfortunately, some, even the president, don't want to understand, because they say, my country is first. And they don't realize that the water is public good. Because if we say first what is mine and then everything is subordinated, it's a country that lives with an energy that comes from fossil material, that is to say, petroleum. I am a close friend of some priests that are engaged in rooting out the new forms of slavery in the Louisiana state, in the United States. And they don't believe in the climate change. And say, well, catering has affected you a lot. Yes, but we have been able to rebuild everything. And yes, they have beautiful houses. There is a lot of beauty. But they have built their houses. But they damage the planet even more. So this is a problem that we have to face. That's why there are so many other issues to address, but I want to focus on this one in particular. And we should take this into account, which is stated in the World Report. Luckily, in the Water Resources 2020 report, that hears what the Academy is saying, or was saying more than 20 years ago, as well as the Pope. The Pope said it here. Pope Francis stated this when he took part in the 2017 meeting or forum, and he said that the problem was so serious that he thought that this good water is so valuable, because without water is no life, and without we devastate the country, that could trigger a world war. Let us imagine. So the sign, the warning sign that it was. It's a very dramatic situation that, in the light of the situation, we cannot clearly be aware of what the problem is. Even in the document created by the Congregation for the Human Development Association, led by Comat Turson, the document is not signed by him. He doesn't address this issue. So we talk about other issues. I feel that here there is a hierarchy of problems and a hierarchy of solutions. The first problem is this one. We are destroying the water sources and rewarming or heating the planet. Solutions address this use of fossil material. At least we should try to remove the carbon dioxide from it. Some are attempting to do that in the case of petroleum. And another solution that is more available, and I saw it before I became a chancellor, is to turn the seawater into drinking water. And that is something that is being done now with quite economical and fast solutions. We should consider that too. Thank you very much. I remain at your disposal. Thank you very much. Now we will hear from Kate Rowe.
Great. Thank you so much. I first want to express my appreciation to the organizers of this forum, the panelists, and all the participants. I represent the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, which, as per my introduction, is led by Professor Mariana Mazzucato. And doing my research, getting ready for this forum, it reminded me that 2 billion people lack drinking water. twice that experience severe water shortages at least 1 month out of the year. And for me, it said, this is an issue of publics. This is an issue of purpose. This is an issue of innovation. So very good to be joining here from IIPP. So I come here and I join not as a specialist in water issues, but as a political scientist with a background in international development and increasingly doing a lot of work on SDGs and responsible business. So that says a little bit about my perspective. And IIPP has been extremely busy. It's a fast-growing, in-demand institute, but particularly in this time of COVID, when we're seeing so much change, so much radical thinking, this moment of sort of intense rupture and creative destruction. It's been a very exciting time where we're seeing new possibilities and new ways of thinking. And that's particularly important for us because we're very interested in reimagining the role of the state. So the state gets a bad rap as being slow and bureaucratic and ineffective. And we ask, how can it be bold, entrepreneurial, public spirited? How can it provide leadership? How can it solve inequalities? And there was a moment of pessimism about the state that I think we're seeing pushed back with good actions around COVID, places where we're seeing effective leadership and a recognition that some of these big problems really need these kind of collective solutions. And so we talk about also going from issues like leveling the playing field, having the state de-risk investment, for example, to how do we tilt the playing field? How do we give a direction for innovation, a direction for growth? How do we build policy and industrial strategies around missions that are rooted in grand challenges and SDGs, including water issues? And we talk about innovation and policy as political, not only in the sense that people help to shape where innovation goes, where policy goes, not only that it affects us, but also that the state is intimately involved in decisions about investment, in decisions about whether or not green technologies go forward, to speak to the earlier point. So one thing when I was, again, preparing for these short remarks that I thought about was really important work done by a political scientist named Peter Haas in the late 1980s. And he wrote a very famous paper on pollution in the Mediterranean. And we study it and we keep teaching this paper because he introduced or popularized the idea of epistemic communities. And I think part of what makes this forum and work like it so important is that it's helping to build an epistemic community around these issues of water, and particularly around the idea of water and clean water as a right. And Haas lays out really key roles that these epistemic communities play. And he said, first, they create a shared sense of normative or principled belief. What does it mean to say water is a right? Why do we think this problem matters? You know, we're all coming together because we think the world can be better around this issue and that there's a clear direction that needs to go. So it's bringing this idea of beliefs, of normative beliefs to the core. An epistemic community also has shared causal beliefs. We look at data, we look at evidence, we make arguments about what is driving this problem. Those can be biological arguments about the role of climate change. They can be political arguments about how goods are distributed, how economies work, how markets are created. And so this idea of causal belief is very important. And epistemic communities come together to put forward a set of propositions about what's causing these problems that allow policymakers to respond. Similarly, epistemic communities, like those that came around and formed around the issue of pollution in the Mediterranean, they share a notion of validity. What evidence? We bring ideas, we bring, principles for making decisions. So here, work on things like the precautionary principle become very important. What level of evidence do we need before we act? And so making judgments about that, coming to conclusions about that, again, is extremely influential for policymakers, where there's an idea or set of beliefs that are very strong about a problem that can shape how politics move. And the final aspect that Haas pulls out is this idea of a common policy enterprise. We want to change the ways policymakers act. We want to change policies. We want to change how citizens engage with these issues, how corporations engage with this issue. And so I really like the idea of these forums as a way of bringing together experts, bringing together people from different parts of the world to form a common language, to form a common understanding of this problem. And that is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. We've got wonderful cases of that making a difference throughout history. So my final point, and I'll be brief in my comments, is one thing that we really talk about a lot at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is the idea of using missions to help us form policy and help us decide the strategies going forward for government. And this is sort of a provocation, the idea of a mission, sort of a provocation for public policymakers. And it's a critique, particularly around, like I said, innovation strategy or industrial strategy. So a traditional industrial strategy would say we need a strong automobile sector. And what we say is, really, is that what you want? Is that the goal of the policy? What if we say leadership in electric vehicles? What if we say a transportation sector that's sustainable and inclusive? The kind of goals we set, the mission we set as publics, as governments, leads a direction of where resources flow, where innovation flows, and shapes us from just saying, oh, we want an automobile sector in the UK, to saying we want to have leadership in this type of technology. We want to drive change in a certain direction. And so for me, the interesting thing to raise, in addition to pulling together this epistemic community, is to say, what would a mission around clean water mean for a government? How do you write a mission that is bold and relevant, that is clear and targeted, measurable and time-bound, is ambitious, brings together people from different sectors, just like this forum, from different disciplines, and engages in bottom-up solutions? So that's sort of the challenge I want to leave this forum with, is to, well, think about how do we create these epistemic communities where we have share ideas of validity, share ideas of what the problem is, and share idea of direction, and how do we bring that and articulate that as policy missions, where instead of just saying, oh, we want to have this kind of sector, or we want to have good innovation, to say, what kind of innovation, what kind of sector, what kind of well-being do we want? And so that's really one of the core questions we ask, and the core question we ask of our students as well. So in conclusion, I want to just reinforce that states need to be bold in setting direction. They need to consider missions. And maybe this is something I can talk to in the Q&A. I don't necessarily see this as a problem of tools. I see this as an issue of getting people on board, of political will, and of creating an unstoppable set of understandings about what needs to be done and what the world can be. And this is also, and finally, this is a moment of change. This is when we're seeing the ability of people to mobilize a huge amount of resources, take steps that would be unimaginable 6 months ago. And so now that we know it can be done, it's a moment of reevaluation, a moment to seize. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you, Kate. It was very interesting to listen to your remarks. And before moving on, I would like to refer to something you said about the dialogue. This fora for us involve a development on a meeting that we had planned to carry out at the beginning of this year at the Vatican on the right to water. So dialogue, of course, with the participants, because we have a group of participants that have attended this forum from the very beginning. This dialogue is paramount. The dialogue between different members of the academy, the academia, companies, you have representatives of native Indian populations, NGOs. And so this idea to be able to work and have exchanges in dialogue settings and to do some joint work is very important for us. So I just wanted to make those brief remarks before moving on. Now we will hear from Diane Desierto. Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriela and Luis. I thank my fellow speakers in this panel, especially the hosts of this forum, and the opportunity to discuss these critical issues. I take inspiration from what the two speakers have said before me, both about the caveats to the way water governance has been structured thus far, as well as the possibilities for innovation and new forms of public policy making. I work at the intersection of international law and human rights, where there are certain realities in regard to the right to water that we have to contend with. One is that it is a hugely significant capital investment to build up a water infrastructure system. And in the latest study of the World Bank surveying all water concessions in the world, less than 10 water concessions are breaking even. So you have to accept the reality that this kind of enterprise requires massive infusions of capital, considerable risk, and at the same time, very low yields on returns for those in the private sector who will engage in it. The second is that water is not strictly produced by the water concessionaires. It is actually drawn from natural resources which form part of state sovereignty, which are therefore well within the remit of the public. If this is a natural resource, the water resource is not produced by distributors, by water concessionaires, then there's a fundamental quandary of who assumes responsibility for the kind of service that is delivered, for the access to clean water, and particularly getting rid of the problems of non-revenue water, which is water that spills or there's leakage and doesn't get delivered to communities. There is a crystal problem today in the way that regulation is structured around the world when it comes to the right to water. It is simply this: there are contracts that are drawn, concession contracts around the world that are designed to protect the investment, the considerable investment of the private sector with respect to making sure that water is potable, deliverable, and accessible to the public. But there are, in the process of drawing up these regulatory arrangements, very few lines of participation for the actual public that has a direct stake not only in the source of the water, the natural resource, but also in the ultimate delivery and quality of the water as the household or as the consumer. This is where I intend to go briefly into where we are in international law and human rights frameworks in my remaining few minutes to underscore this, that the right to water in the first place is not fictitious. It is a binding legal right that is assumed by all states, that entails particular obligations on the part of states to ensure that third parties that provide access to water will not otherwise interfere with the enjoyment of water by individuals who possess this human right. And that includes considerations of adequacy, availability, accessibility, affordability, and quality. The second point I'm going to say here is that much as we are so in the legal enterprise very much focused on the development of regulation towards the investment side of water, there is less that integrates environmental considerations and human rights considerations within that regulatory framework. So what we're seeing now in the numerous litigations that have taken place in regard to water utilities, especially in Latin America, is that the recourse or redress is with respect to the protection of the investment and less about the public's actual recourse when there is a specific challenge that is faced by a water concessionaire, given, say, an economic emergency, a health emergency, a water source, water natural resource governance issue, which brings into play the climate change issue. And my last point on that is to focus on the fact that it's 2020, And we are glad that we are having this discussion on the right to water, but it's also time to start thinking about what it means to bring the actual public to the table of negotiations on water concession contracts, on the investments that are required, the kind of risk that is assumed by the public in an intergenerational manner. Politicians who will sign agreements within time X, within a specific horizon, may not necessarily be thinking about the intergenerational consequences of a certain form or modality of the delivery of water or technology in the delivery of water without necessarily considering what those environmental consequences are in the management of natural resources, especially when we think about the climate change implications. So let me share my screen and do this and share my computer sound and do this as quickly as possible in the remaining time. Just running through this briefly, there are treaty-based sources of the right to water that largely have been signed by almost all countries and ratified by almost all countries of the world. From the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, even the laws regulating armed conflict provide for the protection of water resources, and in particular, the rights of civilian populations to continued access to safe, quality, potable water at all times. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides for a right to life, which by implication has also been extended to the right to water. Same with respect to the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, where there have been recent studies found that communities of color have had less access to safe, potable water than other communities, which is something also to consider in the nature in which water is provided, distributed, and enabled for communities of disparate geographic, demographic, racial, gender factors. And as I said, this includes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, which by implication includes the right to water, the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, which is all the more important in this time of the pandemic when water is so crucial to ensuring the prevention and treatment and control of this epidemic and other diseases, especially in the delivery of medical services at this time. This is why the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights has always required that in regard to the right to water, there must be priority in the allocation of water for personal and domestic uses, especially to prevent starvation and disease, especially to ensure that every state that is a party to this treaty meets its core obligations on the right to water and the right to an adequate standard of living and the right to health. And the right to water contains both freedoms and entitlements. It does include the freedom to maintain access to existing water supplies and the right to be free from interference, such as the right to be free from an arbitrary disconnection or the contamination of water supplies. The entitlements include the right to a system of water supply and management that does genuinely provide equality of opportunity for all people to enjoy the right to water. This is why, as I was saying earlier, the factors that determine under law whether or not the right to water is being served have already been defined. Is it available? Is there specific quality standards with respect to the provision of the right to water? Is it accessible? And when we talk about accessible, it's accessible to everyone without discrimination, meaning it's physically accessible, economically accessible, or affordable. It is premised on non-discrimination and equality, and there's sufficient information that is given to ensure accessibility to water, water facilities, and related sanitation services. And thus, what are the immediate obligations of states? They have to ensure, and yes, we have to rethink about what states are doing at this time, because their immediate obligation from the very outset is to ensure every individual's exercise of the right to water without discrimination. They have to take deliberate, concrete, and targeted steps to ensure that the entire population realizes the right to water. And most importantly, they cannot take any measure that ends up reducing a population's entitlement or enjoyment of the right to water from the present circumstances, even in a time of emergency. This is why the duty to respect the right to water includes the duty to refrain from interfering with how individuals directly or indirectly will enjoy the right to water, whether it is private or public or a hybrid of a public-private partnership. Those arrangements remain subject to the continuing duty of states to ensure continued enjoyment by all persons of this right. It must protect persons even if a state party has to prevent a third party from interfering in any way with the enjoyment of the right to water. Now, this becomes problematic because when we're dealing with contracts and the individuality of contract clauses and what is guaranteed by states vis-a-vis water concessions, not all of them are in the same template. Not all of them follow the same level of distribution of risk or assumption of risk. But what remains clear, at least from the most recent World Bank study, is that most concession contracts at their inception and negotiation do not include the local communities that basically are part of the natural resource where the water is sourced. Neither do they include the relevant communities to whom the water service is supposed to be made accessible. At the end of the day, the end users, as well as the communities that steward the environmental resource, are left basically in a blank veil, left to imagine what the existing or what the regulatory arrangements will be after state representatives have already discussed with the relevant private sector partner. And in this respect, this is problematic because if a state party has to prevent compromising equal, affordable, and physical access to sufficient, safe, and acceptable water, then an effective regulatory system must already be in place that includes independent monitoring, genuine public participation, and the imposition of penalties for non-compliance with this guarantee. And as such, even when a state party tries to fulfill the right to water itself by either facilitating it through a third party or working directly as the state party provider of the service, it remains obligated to take positive measures to ensure that individuals and communities do enjoy this right and enjoy it as equitably as possible. There's related international environmental law here that we could probably discuss in the Q&A that does emphasize equitable and reasonable utilization of water courses, which are the sources of water, and in particular, obligations against causing transboundary harm. There's also related other sources of international environmental law that do focus on health-based targets, water safety monitoring frameworks, and verification of drinking water quality. SDG 6, as pointed out earlier, has already pointed out that well before we had COVID, 2.2 billion persons in the world lack safely managed water. 4.2 billion lack safely managed sanitation. Over 3 billion persons worldwide do not have basic hand washing facilities in the world. There will be water scarcity that will displace around 700 million persons in the imminent future. This is why, at this point in time, what we push for in international law and human rights is immediately to realize the human right to water. We have to get rid of the regulatory overlap that in no way addresses the immediate concerns of the consumers and the households and the local communities who have the most immediate stake in the realization of this right. There has to be harmonization between concession contracts, investment law, regulatory and administrative law, and international environmental law to ensure the meaningful participation of affected communities in water regulation. Beyond participation, there must be a remedy. To this date, there is no direct mechanism for redress for victims of violations of the human right to water. They will either try to litigate directly, which is difficult when you don't have the resources, against tremendous, huge entities, and when they can invoke immunities from litigation in their own jurisdiction. There is nothing to this end so far. I'm part of the drafting team that came up with the 2019 Hague Rules on Business and Human Rights arbitration, which is one of the possibilities to try and give a direct mechanism for individuals themselves to be able to seek that remedy and repair from business when we do face challenges in regard to the realization of this human right. And lastly, what is most important to my heart here at the University of Notre Dame is reparative justice. There are so far not a lot of views looking at the scope of human rights reparations when we don't consider the sources of discrimination and inequality that result in a very disparate enjoyment of the right to water. I've given the statistics earlier, and I'll stop sharing from here, but perhaps thinking about these three aspects is something that could get us started in this discussion for possible solutions. Thank you very much to the organizers.
Thank you, Diane. Very interesting, your presentation. And now we close the panel with Enrique Cresto. Enrique Cresto, the floor is yours. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Gabriela, Luis, and the panel members who have made their presentations. I want to thank the Institute for Global Dialogue and the Culture of Encounter. I want to let you know who I am. My name is Enrique Cresto, the creator of the National Entity of Water Works for Sanitation. It's a national state entity created in the 90s, and its paramount goal was to organize the access to safe drinking water and sanitation to more than 45 million of Argentine people. I have some slides to share with you regarding what has to do with building a water justice. But I also want to let you know that until a short time ago, I was the mayor of a community of 2,000 inhabitants. In 2016, we went to the Vatican and we undersigned the Padua Covenant. The Padua Covenant on the communication of the Laudato Si in June 18, 2015. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, wanted the Laudato Si not to be one more encyclical letter, but in addition to the scientific value and what it means to the sustainable development, the union of families, in what has to do with sustainable development, sustainable and comprehensive development of the planet, the idea was that the government leaders and policymakers and trade unions and different institutions can reshape these principles into social ones. And that has to do with the Padua Covenant. In its principle number 8, said that we have to guarantee the universal right to water, health, and sanitation. In 2020, I was called upon by the president of my country, Alberto Fernandez, to transform the state policy into what has only been a public policy and has changed from government to government and has changed depending on the government's policies. And what I can say is I was listening to numbers attentively. Argentina is a large country, it's a water-based country that is surrounded by rivers and streams, and it faces the same problems that most developing countries. It cannot guarantee its inhabitants access to safe water and sanitation. Many Argentine people do not have access to safe water, and more than 1/3 of Argentine people do not have access to sanitation. I think think I'm going to share. Technology is stronger than me, uh, defeated me. So I will be telling you about the different goals that have to do with building of a water-based justice. There are many slides. So, so I think it's right to have a 10-minute presentation. What has to do with the Laudato Si? We talk about the importance and the quality of water in future. When we talk about the importance of water, I think we can talk about two different asymmetries. The territorial asymmetry. In some other parts of our country, we have 10 provinces out of the 24 that do not have, that have a difficult access to water. And then we have the sectors that are most vulnerable, sectors that have a higher purchasing power. And regarding the quality of water, what we can see on a daily basis is that deep water is not supplied because the water tables have been polluted and are not suitable for human consumption. So we have to make large investments on surface water in our rivers. And we also have sanitation. Lack of sanitation ends up causing sewage conflicts. In the province of Tucumán, we saw a claim from one governor to another because where in one city a province drips a sewage in the river, soon the other province uses that water for drinking purposes. And as regards the right and the access to water, we know that the United Nations until 2010 with the resolution 9420 declare water and sanitation as paramount rights. And from them on, I think state policies have to be created in the different hierarchies in the national, provincial states, and what has to do with the municipal entities. What we see today is that we have increasingly more conflicts. There is a community and environmental impact perceived in the most vulnerable sectors. Argentina has 3.3 million square kilometers, but have more than 450 slums. These slums or popular neighborhoods are those in which the state does not guarantee a plot of land. Lands have been trespassed, and these neighborhoods do not have access to water. They don't have networks. They don't have sewage systems, and there is where we have to work. And COVID affects these people dramatically because when COVID-19 enters, the neighborhood has to be closed down because when COVID is installed in these slums, due to lack of water sanitation, COVID cases increase dramatically. And this is an issue of pressing concern in Argentina and Latin America, where COVID is more serious. And then we have the marginated groups, where we see that different neighborhoods are fighting because they have a limited access to water. And due to a scarcity of water, there are neighborhood disputes because when one neighborhood doesn't have access to water, this neighborhood blames another one. Today, there is a lack of state policies, not only at an Argentine level, but at a worldwide level. the government system that is most accepted is democracy. In the party that I represent, which is called Justicialismo, it is said that the government does what the people want it to do. Another of the major drawbacks that we see is that there are three paramount foundations that have to do with the water justice, and that has to do with the St. Thomas justice, giving everyone what belongs to them. There are three similar issues shared by all countries, developing countries. First, there should be a regulatory framework of the states where to public order and that has to do with the paramount human right is a legally protected right. There should be a national law that sets the guidelines for the distribution and regulation of access to water. And we should always aim at the most vulnerable sectors and guarantee any minimum access to vital water. On the other hand, the other major issue we find is that no state policy has been adopted. On a personal note, when I traveled to the Vatican, the first thing I did was to summon the councilmen and officers and said we have to transform these tenets, the fight against discrimination and hunger, into state policies. And transforming them into state policies is to reflect them in budgets. So each municipality has to consider the funds they are going to invest not only in awareness raising, but also on what has to do with the expansion and network works so as to reach out to all neighbors living in this city. And what also has to do with this is awareness raising. Awareness raising for the wise use of water, because when we say that the government does what the people want it to do, there is a demand for social awareness in the use of water and knowledge in those areas where there is water regarding what's happening in other parts of the world. Due to the children mortality cases, and what has to do with the lack of access to water when we don't take care of it. What has to be clear is that we have to create the foundations to control this issue. If we don't transform what has to do with the regulation and distribution of water into state policies, if we don't take on the different hierarchies with budgets, it's going to be unlikely to achieve the Laudato Si principles, but we are not going to achieve the SDG 2030 that established that to reach 100% of water after diagnosis, we need $22 million. How can we distribute these $22 million of investment annually? It's going to be impossible, and it's going to be only wishful thinking to reach 100% of water. It's important to have a water map. In each country, the government has to have a water map and know the situation of each one of them and the diagnosis to come up with a solution. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Enrique. I want to thank Kate, Marcelo, and Diane, who have to leave right now. Before you leave, if it is possible, the regulation issue, the idea of thinking about regulation in future is part of the critical problem we have at present. Both Notre Dame and the Institute for Innovation and Public Purposes in the city of London. I have just forgotten the acronym, IEPP. They are working hard on an innovative metrics. I have two remarks to consolidate this presentation. Then we'll continue with Marcelo and Enrique. Is it possible? Kate, some remarks regarding this issue?
To speak to metrics and regulation? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Kate.
Excellent. So I think my comments actually fit very well with Diane's, because I think what I was trying to speak to was ideas around political will, problem identification, motivating policymakers to see problems in a way that they can address them. That's the important work we've been seeing around climate change. That's the important work we've been seeing around water access, pollution, in a lot of different areas. So there's a need to mobilize support, mobilize understanding, and build a common understanding of a problem. And then from there, you'll have the buy-in, you'll have the support to do some of the technical work for the regulation. So I see these as very complementary and as sort of two parts, two phases. This is the problem identification part of the policy cycle, which we teach. So I'll leave the sort of regulation to Diane, but I think this idea of getting people to gain a common understanding is really an important first step, a way of mobilizing action, letting people know they have these rights so that they can be realized. In terms of metrics, that's a much longer discussion. And so I don't think I'll engage with that right now. But yeah, just again, because I have to run, I really appreciate the panel and really appreciate everyone's insights on this extremely important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Diane, your remarks, please. And then we'll be hearing from Luis Modino, who is in Manaus.
Thank you very much, Luis. I am inclined also to be optimistic, if only for the fact that there have been new forms of community development agreements that's actually been initiated under the auspices of the World Bank. Generally, they're being rolled out for infrastructure projects, but we are increasingly looking at those community development agreements and how they could be transformed and migrated into the water sector. So in the areas that I've worked in the Philippines, there has been considerable promise in this respect, because when the community, as the empirical findings are and the regulatory findings are, when the community is involved from start to finish in the planning of the sector and the monitoring and coordination with the sector, and with full transparency with respect to the operations of the sector, it's possible to build a durable public-private partnership that is also profitable for the concessionaire, but most importantly, sustainable for the communities. So I would like to at some point probably explore this further with the forum, but I do want to say that there is a lot of optimism in this area. We're starting to do this more intentionally with the business sector.
Thank you, Diane. We know that you're in a hurry, but we really appreciate your presentation of the previous one. Just like in the case of Enrique, I want to tell you that the first time Enrique took part in the forum, he knew that he had to participate 3 minutes before, because Martin Hin, who is the Secretary of Public Policy, told him, I cannot make it. So he said, well, we know Enrique, we have been working with him for a long time. So he's among the participants, and we told him, okay, you have to take the floor and you speak. So we had some time to address a deeper and more necessary issue. So once again, thank you, Enrique, for participating. Thank you, Diane. The other time we had some technical inconveniences, and today it was fixed. Regarding these issues mentioned by Marcelo regarding the desalinization of sea, mentioned by Alberto Monsini and Jose Luis of Santander. Marcel said that he's a friend of Cardinal Osoro. They say that the desalinization deserves a critical attention of water problem, the high energy cost. Alberto says that this is a high energy demanding project. With high clean sources, the problem is recycled again. Jose Luis says that even the energy consumption has been reduced by square meter is still high and it contributes to the climate change. Roughly more than 40% affects the sea ecosystem. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences has an energy transition talk. How do you see the evolution of the debate and challenges of climate change? Because it doesn't suffice to just express that we have to reduce the climate change. How do you analyze the growing strategies and what are the views that have started to evolve from the academy regarding this issue? The situation is serious because our expert, Jose Molina, Ramarratan, Emiliano and Krutze from the Netherlands, from the national entities. I am a member of the UN Council, and the UN, at the UN, when I talked to Gutierrez and the head of this council, who is Evi Sachs, they think that nothing has been done in this time. Not only due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which aggravates the problem, but before. Is a part of the position or the policy adopted by the American president. So at the end of the day, there has been a setback. We have gone back in time. First, regarding the denial of the problem, those that deny the problem. First and foremost, President Trump, who says that he doesn't believe in the pandemic, and he doesn't believe in health either. So what the states do is paramount in this case. If we think about the meeting we had in Argentina at the Macri's administration time, due to the great efforts made by Europe, this issue was raised, and Mr. Trump was the only one that didn't want to participate. So he's hopeful that things are going to change. The Chinese government doesn't say anything but doesn't do much. If the Americans don't do anything, they don't do much. So the Chinese government says that they agree with the climate change. They are working on climate change. Because if we go to different Chinese cities where there was a difficult climate change situation before, we can see that things have changed. For example, in Peking, everything is perfect and nice there. But efforts are being made, but they are not. The efforts are not adequate. They do not suit the situation. There should be at least less warming, heating. Nothing has happened. This is objective data and is going to be addressed by Pope Francis in the next ordinary sessions in September. When the Pope addresses this issue, he has talked about this. He has said we have to think of a solution for people and the climate. I think this is important because if people understand that they are going to lack water because they don't preserve the climate, they understand that the climate change problem affects them just like cigarette affects their health. Perhaps they might change and they put pressure. I know priests that are very good at certain topics, but they don't believe in this issue, so they choose Trump, Mr. Trump. There's the New York Cardinal is having a dinner with the Republican Party. We do as I say, but not as I do. This is a vital problem. It affects health and the life of planet and human beings. We are truly worried about this issue. We emphasize this warning necessity to educate people, and this issue has been addressed in this forum to think about future scenarios and the problem solutions. Gabriel Liberto asked a question. I don't know if Ernesto has a sister. Among the three failures in the water justice, what policies are in place? Romina, who is a biologist and university teacher, would like to know what relationship we can find between water justice and fossil policy. Like, I'm a university teacher. Enrique, if we can address these issues, and then we will give the floor, or we will have Gabriel Eckstein and the other participants take the floor too. When we talk about water justice, it has to do with principles and values, scale of principles and values. Until now, I'm the president of the bloc, the Argentine bloc, and what we can see is that municipal budgets, as there isn't a national law, there isn't a national law that regulates it, and there isn't social awareness that pushes this project from downwards. There isn't a state policy to address sanitation. If we know that in a country like Argentina, we need to invest $22,000 million among municipalities, nations, and provinces to reach 100% of water and go over this 75% of sanitation, this has to be enshrined in the budget. It's evident that we have to have international funding that is available in Argentina. There are bilateral funding initiatives that are carrying out sanitation works. But this has to do with the lack of a state policy. I'm the president of the National Entity of Water Works for Sanitation. And what we do is to understand that we have to, the nation has not worked on these issues. Provinces did not have responsibility for these issues. As there is an intervention due to public order, state right, the market regulates the water, not the state. So the vulnerable sectors, providers do not invest, and the entity in charge of helping these 1,800 states, there were not agreements with these providers, and there was not budget to put in place this initiative. So there should be a state policy. That's why these entities increased its budget from 2019, 2020 in more than 1,000% to reach the goals. Not only was it raised in the Lodato, yes, but also in the United Nations. That last reply encapsulates what Ela Lombardi said. Can we hear to Luis Mondino? I cannot see him yet. Nelia Rodriguez says that vulnerable sectors in Argentina are a current reality, a permanent reality. What is the idea of public policy for native populations who have their rights undermined? This issue affects Argentina and the different peoples in general. I would like Luis Modino to join us. He's good at describing this process. He's a Spanish priest, he's a Manaus, and even if we have had these off-programs strategies to have someone that is not taking part in the forum, it will be good to listen to him in the context of pandemic, in connection with the environmental right, for which we want to have a global efficient covenant. There are many covenants, but not all of them are efficient. I'd like to know your views and your standpoint and your contribution to this kind of discussion. First, I want to thank you for having me here and to briefly participate in this forum. I would like to talk about the social environmental situation in Manaus that has a lot to do with what has been addressed in this forum and in the previous ones. I would say that the first thing we can say is that Manaus is an open scar amidst the Amazon region that has triggered a serious crisis, above all over the last 50 years. And there is a time which was 1967 when the free region of Manaus was created. Apart from the social environmental consequences, direct direct social environmental consequences, it brought about also indirect consequences. There was a large group of immigrants to Manaus. Between 1991 and 2014, Manaus population doubled, reached 2 million inhabitants in 2014. Above all, with the arrival of many migrants from different states, at that time from Peru and Colombia. But also the population inland the Amazon area. There was a lack of public policies in connection with education and sanitation. This was clearly this has been shown at the times of the COVID-19 pandemic. This trigger growing rise of population, which rose without any drinking water or sewage systems, and dramatically extended to the Amazon jungle and undermined the rivers. That had serious consequences, serious social environmental consequences. In Manaus, we can see that 30 or 40% years ago, people had problems because they were polluted. We can see how there is the lake river called Black River. It's very polluted. This is being worsened as the privatization of these services are stronger, and the state in the different levels does not want to address the issue of water and sanitation, above all in the peripheral areas. And another major impact is the so-called slashes port. This project is more than 10 years old, and thanks to the civil society fight, it has stopped. It was built in the waters encounter where the two rivers met. In Brazil, between the Colombian and Peruvian border, the Amazon River is called Somoza. When it meets Black River, and then it is called Amazon River again. This is not something that affects only Manaus, but is perceived in all the Amazon region, and it's the reason for migration towards Manaus due to the pollution, lack of healthy food, especially fish. And this is worsened in the peripheral areas in Manaus. Sustainable development alternatives are offered, but they don't meet the current scenarios. They favor these projects promoters rather than improving the lives of native Indian populations. Even at times it damages these populations and the activities that they have always done. Some pathways to consider. We have to promote public policies for basic sanitation, both in Manaus and in all the Amazon region cities, environmental education at schools and in communities, and to be willing to listen and want to learn from native Indian populations that have been able to preserve the Amazon region for years. And from a Christian point of view that we cannot neglect, we have to adopt a specific proposal of the Amazon document and consider the principles enshrined in the Laudato Si document. Thank you very much for the opportunity of participating. Thank you. And it's crystal clear that the work is to educate with these communities, with this ecological transformation. We should be collective for water and sanitation and provided by a specific company. We'll hear from Diego Berger, and then we'll hear from Marcelo. Diego Berger, as you remember, he is a member of Mekorot Israel. He's in Haifa, and the idea should be that the water source should be sustainable at water resource level and as well as finance resources. The price of water should cover all costs, and this makes us think that Israel has a regulatory water tariff model and an algorithm that symmetrically distributes people's consumption possibilities. This issue is interesting because water has a production cost, and this utopian idea we want to draw water from the river is utopian. We have to work on river sanitation. That involves working harder on sanitation and in wetlands. Are you ready, Marcelo? You wanted to make some remarks? These are some issues we address in the different fora. Marcelo, I can see him. Can you hear us? Your microphone is off. Okay. Regarding the question I was asked about the attitude to take in light of this scenario, there is a quote I was referred to based on a speech made by John Paul VI in the academia. In a meeting to turn artificial membranes to desalinize seawater, because in the water problem already existing in 1975, nothing has been done to solve this problem. So the problem has been aggravated. So John Paul VI said, what should we do? And he said, I don't want to meddle into the specific scientific initiative regarding the desalinization of seawater. But I do want to say what attitudes a scientist should adopt, even more if he is Christian. So he states there are two attitudes. Scientists should honestly consider the future Earth issue. So it's not Pope Francis that thinks that, because the right-wing followers criticize him. that are paid by Donald Trump. It's not Pope Francis, but the Concilium, John Paul VI and Jesus Christ. They have to honestly worry about the humankind earthly future. And as in their responsible role, they have to help pave the way for that and preserve mankind and remove the old. We know that this solidarity with the future generation creates the highest quality form most men are sensitive to. We are talking about 1975. And the scientists should be encouraged by the trust that nature keeps secret police possibilities that intelligence has to unveil and use to reach goals or to reach a sustainable development. This was mentioned in the cyclical letter that is among the creator's plans. This hope in the author and the human spirit in both. It's adequately understood to create a new peaceful energy to researchers. I wanted to tell you that because the issue of water dates back to 1975, and the Pope said, I think that the desalination issue, and an agreement has been entered, quite economical solutions have been mentioned. So we have to keep on researching because it's going to be very difficult to stop the climate change with the governments we have. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcelo. Especially the notion of solidarity mentioned by John Paul VI for the coming generations, and that is the notion of general sustainable development. Diego Berger is taking part in this forum. It's a announcement, and he will be participating in Lima, Peru, and will have he will be making a presentation soon in hydrological systems and right to water. Now we'll give the floor to Gabriela. Thank you very much, Marcelo. At the end of this forum, we will resume these conversations with our panelists. Gabriela, thank you. Thank you, Luis. Now we'll be starting the second panel. Joanna, I cannot see you, but the floor is yours. There you are. So, Joanna said, sir, the floor is yours. Thank you, Gabriela.
Muy bien. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here presenting. Thank you for this invitation. And particularly, it is fascinating to follow what the encyclica has generated in terms of discussion and inspiration to so many people around the world. So what I wanted to do today is to share with you the findings of a recent report that I published. I am a researcher based at the London School of Economics, working at the Climate Change Research Institute of the LSE. And one of the works that we do looks into all the body of climate laws and policies, and also litigation around the world. And I think this is, well, it's not directly related to the topic of this meeting. It is also important because we've been discussing here so much the rights to water, the rights to a clean environment, and we think about having the rights in terms of having laws that protect those rights. But it is also important to consider that once you have those laws, you can also enforce them. And this is where courts might play a very important role. And this is something that we are observing. We've been seeing in environmental law for so many decades already, but that more recently we're seeing in the realm of climate change. And of course, climate and environmental protection are all part of the same story. So how you can use legal strategies to protect the environment, climate, and water is very much a part of the same story, as I said, and also something that one can benefit from the other. So hopefully some of the findings of our report, which is available on the Grantham's website, I will add here the link, can be helpful for you to think in terms of what legal tools, to what extent these legal tools are part of a broader governance strategy that can be used, for example, to protect water resources. So I will share with you my screen just to show a few graphs that summarize the findings of our report. I'll be very brief because I have 8 minutes in total, and anyone who's interested can then refer to that to this document. So hopefully this works. Let me come to the beginning. So this is the report that I was mentioning. It looks at what have been the trends in climate change litigation. So all the cases that have been brought around the world involving the protection or any issue of law or fact dealing with climate change. And what we do in this report is we look at the last year. So of course, there are many years of history of climate litigation, but we look at what are the highlights of last year. And I want to bring some of these to you, and hopefully you will be able to imagine how this important new trend of climate litigation can be used to protect other rights, including the right of water. So if you haven't heard about climate litigation before, this might be an interesting map to look into because the majority of cases of climate litigation is concentrated in the US. So if you see here in this map, you will see that there are over 1,200 cases brought in the US. And then the rest of the 300 and some, almost 400 cases that we know of in all other countries outside of the US. So very much a US centric, but this is changing. So more and more we see other countries starting to use courts to protect the rights of people who have been affected by climate change, and also to make governments more, basically to drive ambition in that governments will legislate more or will enforce legislation that is already in place. So how do we monitor this? And I think if you're not aware, I would recommend that you look at these platforms. These are online databases that are open, free, so available to everyone. And here you can look at all the climate policies and laws in the world. So if you see here, there are almost 2,000 climate laws and policies that out there. And this is useful if you're thinking, if you're a legislator that wants to understand what other countries are doing and what you can do. And also basically just any person who is involved in protecting the climate and the environment. And then we also look at these cases that have been taken to courts in the US and in our partners database, the Columbia Center, here on the right side of the screen, and everywhere else in the world in our Grantham web page. So I told you that we've been seeing an increase in number of cases. I think this graph shows you clearly what I'm talking about. So climate litigation basically didn't exist in the 90s. There were just a few cases, mostly in the US. And then we see, especially since 2008, 2009, after basically the failure of the Copenhagen Conference of Parties and the understanding that what governments are committing internationally is insufficient to protect climate, we see how litigants are bringing climate to courts with more frequency. And this graph finishes in May 2020, but we can only expect that this is still going to continue to grow. But there's an issue, because of course, if anyone who's already who studies or who think about going to court, bringing a case to court, will know there's a risk in bringing a case. You don't know necessarily if by bringing a case you will be successful or not, or you also don't know who's bringing that case, because of course an NGO can bring the case to try to make the government be more proactive, but also a company can file a case against the government that has regulated and therefore try to weaken climate regulation. So we did an analysis to understand if the outcomes of this litigation is more favorable or unfavorable to climate. And while it's not a kind of vast majority of those cases that have been decided, we see that so far, at least outside of the US, courts have been relatively green. So deciding more favorable to climate change protection. What I want to emphasize now is a few specific trends of this type of litigation. And we see how human rights have been really important as a grounds for this case, for these cases. And I expect it would be the same for so many cases dealing with water, in that this is a basic human right. While that's a clear statement for water, it hasn't been so clear-cut for climate. So it took time for courts to understand that the right for a stable climate is a human right. And these are some of the cases that have helped making this connection clear. So the first is a landmark case really brought by an NGO called Urgenda against the government of the Netherlands. And this is the very first time that you find a government telling, a court telling a government, you have to do more. Your action is not sufficient. The other cases are one brought by this gentleman in which he seeks the recognition of a refugee status. He's being forced to leave his island in Kiribati and move to New Zealand, and he tries to get that status recognized. He's not successful, but it's a case that starts reminding us of how we might see more cases of people who have to move from where they are because they're being so deeply affected by changes in the climate, especially in the global south. And the third case is an ongoing case in the US, which again looks at this, it's the right for a future, and is a case brought by a number of young people, which, if successful, could be a very important turning point in the US in getting the state to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in this current Trump era of deregulation. The second trend that I want to emphasize is the litigation that is brought against companies. So the previous one was, I was saying that people are bringing cases against governments. There are a number of cases that are being brought against companies, particularly those few companies that have most contributed to greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution, basically. And it's a small number of companies that have been identified mostly by a research published in a piece of research published in 2014 by Rick Heady. And based on that list of basically companies, many different strategies have been used to show that these companies first might be responsible for the damages and then ask them to pay for these damages. And we see a number of cities and states in the US that are doing that, basically saying, okay, if I have to pay to build higher walls to protect the city, who is going to pay this? It shouldn't be the taxpayers. It could be Chevron or Exxon. We see cases which are showing that these companies have misled the public in not providing information or in creating misleading information that climate wasn't connected to their activities, and also cases that try to link the investments to and avoid the risk of climate change. So, for example, cases brought by students against the University of Harvard, so that the university will divest from these companies. So we see a wide range of cases that are trying to say attack these companies from different channels, and ultimately protect the climate and show that they are a few entities that are mostly responsible for the problem. So I want to finish my presentation with, of course, considering the current situation that we are under COVID-19, where some might argue that we will see a decrease in the new filings or in use of courts to protect the environment and climate, because there are so many other priorities. But at the same time, we can see how there are many opportunities for linking the two emergencies, how we can protect the climate and our planet, and at the same time help do the transition that we've been trying to do for so long. And this is where maybe we will see litigation, for example, challenging bailouts to air companies or to oil companies, and also litigation challenging deregulation. It shouldn't be a time to basically step back, but a time to step forward and try to combine the efforts that we will need to address the current problems with the efforts that we know that are needed in order to address the current climate and environmental crisis. So I stop here, and I will add the link. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay longer because, as Gabriela mentioned, I'm on holidays and my family is waiting anxiously for me to have lunch. But I will add my contact details, and if you have any questions, if you want to discuss something that I won't be able to address in the Q&A, I will be happy to answer later. So thank you very much.
Gracias. Oh.
I'm sorry, I was in the wrong channel. Thank you, Joanna, for your presentation. The idea is that this dialogue should continue, these exchanges should continue. That's what we hope. So, in order to stick to the time slots, we will give the floor to Gabriel Eckstein. Gabriel, are you there?
Okay. Yes, I'm right here. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists. This has been just a wonderful program and a wonderful conversation. And I want to thank Gabriela and Luis and the Institute for Global Dialogue and the Culture of an Encounter for inviting me to again participate in this wonderful program. So I come to this topic as an academic. I'm with the Texas A&M University Law School, where I direct our Energy, Environmental, and Natural Resources program, and I work with my students on different environmental issues, including human rights and how they overlap. I also am president of the International Water Resources Association, which is a global organization of water professionals, water experts that focuses on the science policy interface. And so the translation of science to policy and policy to science, and how to work together on these pressing water issues on a global to a local scale. And so when I come to these kinds of dialogues, I'm particularly intrigued to see the interdisciplinary approach. And we have lawyers, we have scientists, we have politicians, we have religious figures, and this is such a really wonderful collaboration and community to bring this in. And this is what I aspire also to do with my students. For my presentation, I want to focus on, I guess, the theme of this particular panel, which is this new paradigms in environmental law, the challenge of a new pact between humanity and the planet. And I think this is a particularly important theme in the sense that we are always looking for new approaches to address the problems of water provision for people, certainly also for the environment that we live in. And so what we see today, and I think that my colleagues have highlighted some of the problems already. We have the serious problem of climate change. We have burning forests, not only in the Amazon, but elsewhere around the world. We have contamination of the air we breathe. We have water pollution. And the result is that we have people who cannot enjoy clean water for their basic survival. And so this has caused serious problems in many communities around the world. And many people, many communities would say that our system has actually failed. We have a system of regulations and policies and law that is supposed to protect our environment, protect the water resources for people. And many would assert that it hasn't worked by the very fact that we have burning forests, we have polluted waters, we have contaminated air quality, and so on. And so some of these communities have decided to redouble their effort and to try to implement stronger enforcement mechanisms or new laws and regulations. But there's a curious and unique recent phenomenon that I want to relate to you, where communities have taken a different tact, a new approach. And that approach is to give legal personality to rivers. Now, they've also done this to other aspects of the environment, forests, nature, and so on. But I want to focus on legal personality to rivers because it is so connected to people's ability to obtain fresh water. What does it mean to give legal personality? We're talking about having the ability of a river to claim rights almost like an individual, not at the same level of a human. You don't give human rights to a river, but you give them legal capacity to appear in court, legal capacity to protect their rights as a river, capacity to protect their integrity as a water body. And we have seen this occur around the world in maybe a dozen or more scenarios in two general categories. One is in national legislation. And one of the earliest ones occurred in Ecuador, where the legislature, in a constitutional provision, recognized the right of Mother Earth to exist and to evolve. And this was actually successfully tested in a court case in 2011 in the Provincial Court of Justice of Loja, in which the plaintiffs were seeking protection of the Vilcabamba River, and they were successful. In 2010, in Bolivia, you have adoption of a law, number 71, on the rights of Mother Earth, which gave legal standing, the ability of the nature, the river, to come to court and protect its right, almost equivalent as a legal person has the same types of rights, and so on. Probably the most famous legislation providing legal personality for rivers occurred in New Zealand, where you have a national act that implemented historic settlement between the indigenous Maori people and the government. And among other actions, the act granted legal personality to Lake Waikaremoana and the surrounding land and the forests, and also the entire watershed of the Wanganui River. And interestingly, in that situation, the court or the legislation actually created legal representation, a body that was sort of to act as guardians on behalf of these water bodies, so that they have not just this legal right to go to court, but they have somebody who can actually stand in court and represent them and represent their interests. So those are examples of where you have legislation creating this kind of legal recognition. You also have a number of examples where the courts have decided that the legislation in place isn't working, and based on natural law arguments and some other types of arguments, the courts recognize the existence of the legal personality. And this is a little more tenuous, a little more I guess on the extreme in terms of the ability of a court to make decisions, because you always have to draw from statutes and from prior cases. And here you have courts saying, no, this is maybe even a natural right that the rivers should have legal personality. In Colombia, the Constitutional Court of Colombia recognized the Atrato River as a legal person. They said, entidad sujeto de derechos. And they actually ordered a commission, the creation of a commission of guardians to serve as an advisory group and to help represent them in court proceedings to protect their rights. In India, you had a similar situation at not the Indian High Court, but in the High Court of Uttarakhand, which is a state in northern India, in the Himalayan region, where they declared the Ganga and the Yamuna rivers and all of their tributaries as legal persons, and they appointed legal representation to act as their guardians in the phrase that lawyers know, in loco parentis, as if they are the parents of these almost like minor children, but as guardians of these rivers. And this actually, a few days later, they did the same with the glaciers surrounding Gangotri and Yamunotri, rivers, the streams, rivulets. I mean, they expanded this further. Fortunately or unfortunately, soon after, the Supreme Court of India decided to halt these two decisions because they were concerned about how do you implement this? What are the implications? And especially since many of these rivers, the Ganga, the Yamuna rivers, they're transboundary. So you have a high court in one state imposing legal personality, but they don't have the ability to enforce it in another state. So there's some implementation problems here. But this is just a few examples. There's other examples from around the world, Bangladesh, even in the United States, there's been a few efforts to create legal personality for rivers. But so what does it mean to grant legal personality, and what does it achieve? As I said, first, it doesn't mean that the river is an equivalent to a human being. It doesn't mean that the river can enjoy human rights like a person. But it does give the river the ability to protect itself, at least to some extent. And maybe a good example is how we've given legal personality to corporations. Certainly in the United States, this has gone to a significant extent where corporations have freedom of speech even. And that's been recognized by the US Supreme Court, that the corporation can speak when it contributes to a political party. That is a form of speech. Well, if a corporation can have freedom of speech, why can't a river? Why can't a river argue on its behalf in terms of its protection, what it needs, what it desires? Now, obviously, a river can't speak directly, but representation, as represented by guardians, by a commission, and so on, that is entrusted to protect that river. I think there's good legal and policy arguments to make the case that this is a potential argument, a potential process and new approach that could help protect freshwater resources around the world. Now, on a practical level, what does it really do to rivers? Okay, they have the right to appear in court through representation. They maybe even have the right to enter into contracts. If you need somebody to maintain the watershed, well, who's going to do that? You can contract with other organizations, communities, and so on to come in and implement the protections. Maybe even the right to own property. A river, arguably, humans, corporations, they own themselves. Does the river own itself? What about the surrounding area, the watershed? So there's a potential argument that the river could own property. And lastly, the right to sue. The right to sue others who may be causing harm to them. Now, on a theoretical, and to some extent it's still untested level, I guess proponents suggest that these opportunities, these rights that the river can receive, it will help protect itself from pollution, from contamination, from depletion, withdrawals, and so on. And it will in turn create opportunities for people and communities who live along those rivers to enjoy clean, more vibrant rivers, dynamic rivers that help protect the ecosystems, the water quality, and so on. But at the same time, I think this is such a new phenomenon and still not fully tested. There are so many questions that have to be answered. For example, as I said, if a river can sue in this kind of scenario, could the river itself be sued for any harm that it causes to people? For example, if the river floods a community, does it mean that it could be sued then in court since it has legal personality? This is something that, again, it's not been tested. In terms of representation in court, I mean, the reality is you need resources for that. You need money to hire a lawyer. Who's going to pay for the lawyer? Well, in the case of New Zealand, they actually set up, I believe it's a $30 million or $30 million dollar fund to help support that kind of action. But not all rivers have those kind of resources. So there's a question of whether only rivers with wealthy guardians be able to support themselves. And so there's a host of questions that are still unanswered. This is something that we're exploring. And I have to admit, this is an experiment. And some would call this a radical experiment in terms of protecting rivers and protecting rivers for the sake of people, for the sake of the environment. Is this extreme? Possibly. But sometimes we need radical ideas and radical approaches to move forward towards our objectives of adequate water for people and the environment. And I think this new approach should be monitored and should be explored further to see if this is something that is viable and could be something that is utilized as a tool to not only protect rivers and their environments, but also to provide freshwater resources for communities. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. We're going to close this panel with Josiane Gauthier, and then we'll move on to the Q&A section. Josiane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just quickly present who I am. I'm representing SIDSE, which is a network, a family of social justice organizations, international solidarity organizations that are all Catholic and based in Brussels. And we bring our voices together to represent the voices that are not often heard in political spaces. And I've been asked to speak last, which is both an honor and of course a huge challenge. So much has already been said by the brilliant speakers that came before. So I really don't want to be repetitive, and I'll try instead to enrich or build on the interventions that happened before me, perhaps by internalizing a little bit things that we've heard at a more personal level. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for our relationships? My participation and indeed my input today are deeply influenced by the fact that I was part of the Synod of the Amazon last October in Rome. And it was truly a transformative experience for all of us who were there. It seems like a lifetime ago already. Never could we have imagined that this new year would bring us COVID-19 all around the world. And I realize now, of course, that a lot of the important questions that we were discussing at that time during the Synod have continuously fed me through this period, this very strange time. What stayed with me perhaps was at the most was the nature of our relationships, how we form them, how we transform them, how we value them, how we care for them, and what they say about us. We know that during this pandemic, certain truths were highlighted. Our interconnectedness, of course, our interdependence, as we know from Laudato Si', but also the systemic violence and the extractivist exploitation of resources, our insatiable appetite for fossil fuels, and the way we exploit people as well. And what was also reinforced was our ever more urgent and profound need to transform our lives and our systems as they are. In his recent series of catechesis on healing the world, the Holy Father reminded us once again of this call just on August 19th, so recently. Recovery is about healing, which will need justice and truth, and this will require a radical change. So if you're like me, this time has not been an easy one. And the feelings of anger or sadness and disappointment have been frequent visitors. That's why these gatherings are so important, because we need to hold each other up and together. None of us can make these changes alone. We truly do need each other, and I'm happy to share my thoughts with you and hope that maybe we can help each other go beyond our current way of looking at the world and seeing things. I'd like to begin this reflection with a very simple story about water, because that's the subject that's bringing us together today. You may have seen it in the news. It's a small story. In early August, especially in Central Europe, we suffered a difficult heat wave and drought. And we know this to be a direct consequence of global warming and climate change. This is a given. But continuously wearing a mask because of COVID and having been kept inside the whole of our winter, these environmental conditions, in addition to the mental, emotional, social, and economic impacts of COVID, were becoming quite cruel. This was our summer. People wanted to feel a little freer, a little lighter. The unusual heat was rather hard to endure for most people. And luckily, Belgium, as where I am, has a really nice long coastline along the North Sea. Usually it's much too cold for most people, but with this exceptional heat, the coast was a blessing until it quickly became an issue of contention. Too many people were fleeing the city of Brussels to go to the coast for some fresh water and relief. Those who have homes on the coast didn't like this because it posed a health threat and a security issue. To have so many people crowding the trains and beaches. In the heat, the frustration, and the discomfort, there were clashes on the beach, and there was social unrest. The mayors of the wealthier white coastal towns decided to forbid day tourists from the city. People who are often less wealthy and happen to not be so white. This story happens every single day, everywhere in the world, and it's been happening for a very long time. Water, scarcity, drought, it speaks to climate change, speaks to natural resources, but of course it also speaks to race, dignity, social classes, poverty, privilege, and power. How we are facing the climate crisis has everything to do with how we are being exposed to the other crises in our world, how we relate to each other and our planet. And it also says everything about us. We may have been even surprised a little bit, some of us, by the depth of some of the system failures we witnessed during the past few months. All of the flaws in our global systems were exposed, wide open. All of our unpleasant truths and our history of inequality surfaced. All of our own, even personal weaknesses were exposed to the light of day. None of us made it through this without some very honest and perhaps even painful realizations about our own limitations. Colonialism, its historic but also ongoing reality, showed its ugly teeth as we saw how unequal we all were before this pandemic and its solutions. We witnessed the uneven impact and uneven capacity to manage the crisis. We saw democracy and human rights being sacrificed, as some even managed to benefit from the chaos and despair around them. It was devastating to see how easily solidarity and international law seemed to evaporate in some places. All these well-meaning global institutions were not being put to good use. We were now in competition to win the war on COVID. A race to the vaccine, protecting our borders, protecting our resources. As Europeans, as North Americans, as the privileged few and the winners of the great lottery, we must begin to see how weak our claim to power really is and how immense our debt and responsibility is to making some very profound, radical, and courageous changes and choices. On the other hand, during this time, this incredible time, we also witnessed the generosity, the sacrifice to move around, to feed ourselves, to stay in touch. In our great fragility, many of us saw that we had choices, that we could live differently. We can grow and flourish and better ourselves and recover from this crisis stronger, together, closer, and awake, realizing what truly matters to us. As some other speakers mentioned earlier, the first step is not to lose sight of some of the objectives for change that we had already formulated, not to go backwards, not to discard and disregard our previous commitments, and to continue some of the good work which we had begun while learning from what we were experiencing on the planet right now. In early 2020, the political leadership in Europe was poised to make some important changes to better protect this planet, the resources, and the people, to fight climate change, at least in Europe, but hopefully with a positive impact on the rest of the world. The European Green Deal was passed, and some concrete targets for a more ecological and sustainable Europe were set in an ambitious and comprehensive plan. It was not going to be easy. It was never going to be easy. Laws would be required, budgets would need to be negotiated in a context where Euroscepticism was on the rise and nationalist governments were in power in several countries of the continent. But still, as imperfect as this deal is, it was an important step in the right direction, in a new way of imagining the future together. When the global health crisis hit, those of us who were somewhat critical of the European Green Deal, considering that it still saw ecological transition primarily through the lens of economic and technological solutions, were now worried that it would totally fall apart. Would the leaders have the courage to keep some level of ambition and keep looking for a more balanced and sustainable lifestyle, or not? The temptation and pressure to jump into full economic recovery is very strong. But if we are honest, our current way of life is falling apart at the seams. In May, another wave hit. When the Black Lives Matter movement shook the ground in the US, it quickly found its way upriver back to Europe. And for the first time ever, perhaps, Europeans were forced to face their place and their role in all of this. This is not ancient history. This is now. In addition to a global health crisis with economic impact, a climate crisis, lives lost, jobs lost, elderly people forgotten and sacrificed in many places, health systems weakened, children out of school. We have to face the truth. We also have a systemic racial and social injustice issue. And how do we move on without addressing it? How can we address the climate crisis without addressing it? The way we live is directly dependent on systems of injustice towards others, and this is a real reflection of how we treat each other and the earth. As painful and upsetting as all this is, what we do next is perhaps our most important question yet. How we respond is critical. It can change everything. It should change everything, and we have this opportunity. We were forced to stop many things during the lockdown. We stopped certain actions that we love and that we need, but we also stopped many others that are very harmful to our planet, temporarily. We saw that it was possible when faced with a crisis. Can we learn from this experience? And so justice, where justice has been until now. Is there a just, ecological, fair, sustainable, and caring recovery that is possible from this? Can we start by imagining it, and then believing in it, and then bringing it to life? And will we have the courage to do so? Another speaker spoke about value. What we value most is what we will defend and protect. There is no technical fix, no technology or stimulus package or election, no matter how much we want it, or law that will bring the kind of change and transformation we need alone. All of these are useful and helpful, But without a radical change in what we value, we risk staying trapped in a system which continues to hurt and use and throw away. Everything we discussed about decolonizing our minds and hearts, allowing for true conversion, listening to the knowledge, the eternal knowledge that was already there, trusting that we must unlearn certain ideas to be able to receive new ones. All of the inspiration and the love we experienced to live together during the Synod on the Amazon has stayed with many of us and allowed us to understand the world with new words, with new language. And I think this is how it begins. In Europe, in North America, we must face a very disquieting reality about our patterns and our history and our current colonial framework, how we benefit from them still, how we sometimes unconsciously reproduce them. We've not been ready up until now, and we've not had the courage, perhaps, to truly give up on some of the privileges and unfair advantages that we've had. Who likes to give up power and comfort when they have it? But with so many suffering right now from this current arrangement, how can we keep justifying it? This planet cannot endure much more of this, and to be honest, most of us can't either. We're hurting, and when the planet is hurting, we get sick. And we need to organize then. So we must begin to heal ourselves, heal each other and the planet together by caring and by hoping and believing in each other and listening to each other, hearing new ideas and choosing what we value, whom we love. And this way, I think we could find courage we need for the change. And wouldn't that be empowering? Thank you.
Thank you, Josiane. Thank you, Josiane, Gabriel, and Joanna, who had some other commitments. We are going to start now with the Q&A section. As we have Enrique Cresto here. So we try to close this forum. There's a question asked by Elida Lombardi. That I have just seen. We have been talking with Enrico about this issue. Perhaps we know part of the answer. This question is for Enrique Cresto. Elida says, among the COVID prevention measures, it is paramount to have access to water. It's a better medicine. However, both in Argentina and other parts of the world, there seems to be a concern only about vaccine and not about access to water. I would like to know what your opinion is, because COVID-19 seems to be staying for 2 years more, according to what has been declared by the WHO. First and foremost, I would like to tell you that at our entity, National Entity of Waterworks for Sanitation, we have an entity engaged in water and sanitation. This entity works on those issues. First, on the water map, we have to have a city-by-city diagnosis involving all the 1,200 municipalities to know what kind of coverage they have, water and sanitation coverage they have. And in line with that map, we are having providers agreements. Some providers are cooperative associations, others are provinces or the same municipalities. These are financial assistance agreements. We have undersigned agreements with more than 15 provinces for 15,000 Argentine pesos. And we have the Argentina program. We have a plan for 2021 to reach 5 million inhabitants that lack access to water, but we have the networks, but we don't have the expansion pumps. We have to work hard on that. We are working with the Redaba, with the National Register of Popular Neighborhoods. We have almost 5,000 popular neighborhoods, because there is no policy for popular lands. Many families are forced to seize private or state lands without access to any kind of services because they are crowded and they have no other choice. We are working so that we can reach out to these poorest neighborhoods with the funds we are going to be made available, so that we can provide access and water and sanitation to these neighborhoods. We started with a 6,000 million budget annually, and we want to have a 70,000 budget for next year. And the water map implies that the provinces and the municipalities will have to have access to funding options. And that means that a budget should be allocated for water and sanitation. It's the LED lights and other initiatives are important, but that cannot oppose to territorial expansion policies. That has to be on the agenda of each municipality. Thank you, Enrique. Before going on with the next questions, I would like to make a personal reflection, which was very clear and so real. What Josiane Gauthier said when she says that the crisis is not more than the way we treat each other, and that includes the way we treat our planet, the relationship with our planet. I think this reflection underlies most of the exchanges we are having in this forum and in others that have been organized. I have a question made by Julio Lopez Molina. This question is for Gabriel and Enrique. Also for Gabriel, because he participates in the academia. Talking about asymmetries, we have talked about the water tables pollution. At least in Argentina, it's pollution caused by industrial wastes. And at present, a recurrent phenomenon is taking place. That is the intentional wetlands forest for more than 10,000 kilometers. It's a critical ecosystem because these are freshwater ecosystems regulating the water balance. Can we coordinate the multidimensional and cross-sectional approach to address the water problem in Argentina that can include institutional levels and social players? I would like to ask Enrique and Gabriel to reply. Even if this question is related to the province of Buenos Aires, perhaps it can be analyzed from different geographical areas with similar problems. Enrique, would you like to start and then we give the floor to Gabriel? Okay, Gabriel, the floor is yours. Gabriel.
Well, thank you. I'm not familiar with the situation specifically in Argentina, but the contamination of water resources, it's a global phenomenon. We have contaminations of groundwater, aquifers. We have contaminations of rivers and lakes. Much of this is from the way we use our environment, the way we use our rivers and our aquifers and so on. And this is the relationship that we've created with our environment based on our perception, I think, that we are at the apex of society, of the global society. And by society, I mean the whole world in terms of the animal life, and everything on this world. We're at the apex. We're at the top, and I think this may be what Josiana was talking about in terms of the relationship with our environment, that we have to accept the reality that we are part of the environment, and whatever we do to the environment is going to affect us. And this is not just yes, we can affect the environment, and we can adapt better than anybody else, and better than any other species. But it will have an effect on us, and it will especially have an effect on those that are most vulnerable, the poor, those who are in minority communities that are being discriminated against, and so on. And how do you challenge this? How do you fight against this? We can do so from an international level, top down, and admonish countries with, we can try to implement international laws. And this is, I was really interested in Diane's presentation earlier. But enforceability from top down can be very difficult. This is something we have to, I think, have a bottom up approach, where the populations, where the people get involved in their own communities, in their own countries, and say to the government, and in most cases, the people are the government, and they're supposed to be the government, but to say, we have to make a change. We have to have institutions that are responsive to what we need, we as people, we as communities, we as part of the environment, and we have to make those changes and implement them through local regulations, local institutions, and local communities. I think this is a very challenging situation that is a global phenomenon. It's a global problem, and I think that this is something, hopefully, that we can learn from each other. Some communities are more successful than others, and this is something that I think this is why dialogues like this are absolutely necessary, so we can exchange information and experiences.
Thank you, Gabriel. Sí. Sí. Ujú. Ujú. Sí.
Todos sabemos que Gabriela no solo es libre de interrumpir a Luis solo porque pertenece a la organización. Ustedes saben quién manda. Entonces, pero quiero retomar esta idea.
I would like to take up this idea. Asymmetries in public agendas regarding water and sanitation was raised by Gabriel Engstein, Marcelo Sorondo, are always subordinated to other questions. And in this context, we have a very skeptical view regarding what's happening in the climate change. How do we create a coordinated agenda between the state policies and the community? And how do we build a culture of transformation in light of the skepticism that prevails? I made it easy. Josiane, Enrique, you can give your opinions.
Yeah, I can share maybe the perspective of some of the asymmetry that we see in European policy as well. One of the issues is indeed a matter of priorities and competing priorities even within policy, and it's a matter of governance as well. The fact that it's already quite a bit of a gymnastics for an entire continent to try to agree on legislation, which they sometimes managed to do as Europe. And then you have to apply it at the national level, and then you have to see what is competence of local and community level. So it gets quite complex. But in terms of, for instance, the Green Deal, where water and human rights and global climate change policy is trying to be aligned across Europe, and that there is a sanction element which is trying to be entered into this. The problem is the source of funding in one case. Where's the money coming from to finance ecological transition? And the problem is I would say there's a bit of incestuous behavior that happens at times, or where the funding is coming from at the national level back to the European level or the global levels, which then try to supposedly serve ecological transition. Everybody is interested, and this is sometimes a huge challenge for politicians, that they are managing situations where interested parties are not the population you're trying to serve, and that you have private interests that are quite influential at times in public policy. And so this is a huge pressure, and it's a governance issue. And this often creates some of that asymmetry that we see, and we see politicians being put in a negotiating position between the public need and their budgets, and where the sources of funding are coming sometimes, and the conditionality of some of that. And that's in Europe. So I can't even, you have to put that 100-fold in a country that's dependent on foreign aid, for instance, where there's high conditionality as well about results being achieved in the donor country, in their agenda. So there's lots of reasons why you sometimes come up with a result which is not the one you hoped for. But that is a misalignment of interests across a lot of these political bodies. But that's just been my experience with dealing with multi-level politics.
Yeah, I want to maybe highlight another of these different levels of capacity, and maybe also respond to a few of the comments that have been made by some of the attendees. In terms of multinational companies and these large conglomerates, these large businesses that are often have a budget that is larger than many countries' budgets. And I think part of the problem that we have is that we have, in many countries, we have given companies carte blanche, the complete right to act without responsibility. And we used to talk about internalities and externalities, and the idea that you can have a particular impact that's within the company, but you ignore what's happening outside. You ignore the air pollution, you ignore the water pollution. And we were always trying to incorporate how do we make the companies pay for those externalities. And we had ideas of polluter pays principles, and maybe even the user pays principles, because it's the consumer who wants the product, so maybe they need to pay for that impact. But I think that some of these notions, not only have they not been implemented, but because companies have been given such broad leeway to operate and such power within the legal system, within the political system, people and communities, I think, have been pushed to the side in terms of decision making. We often want the government, we elect the government to make decisions on our behalf, but then again, we have governments who are being supported by companies in their election campaigns and so on. And there's such an intermingling of this private sector and government without an intermingling of the community and the government. And this is something that I think is lacking in many places around the world. So when you have, when you can point fingers at a private sector, private company that is causing pollution, the government is also culpable in that. And the problem is that the communities, the people, are not being given an equal voice, or at least participatory voice in decision-making in terms of how should these companies be allowed to operate. Now, I'm not someone who wants to regulate companies to an extreme, to such a situation where they can't make money, but there has to be responsibility. There has to be responsibility that in most cases the companies won't take on themselves. It has to be regulated in some fashion.
Thank you, Gabriel.
brevísima reflexión.
I would like to briefly reflect upon this remark, and let's see what you have to say.
Si combatimos la intermitencia,
If we fight the intermittent management in public policies and we build state policies, is it possible to have a covenant between the humankind and the planet? A new covenant between the humankind and the planet. What does it require?
esa primera idea.
This first idea.
You're presenting this to me? Okay. I guess my question would be, what do you mean by this covenant between humans and the planet? What exactly is this relationship that you're trying to forge in this covenant? So I don't know if you have, what is the vision? Because I can create my own vision, but I'm not sure what your vision is here.
Mine is that sometimes we answer with the same question. That's very common. I would say that we are thinking about building a future and the work it involves, the work that involves understanding the right to water and this process in relation to the future, and analyze that the classical environmental paradigms are facing a crisis and that we need a new environmental right paradigm, and the right is much more important than to be left only in the hands of the lawyers. And in light of this climate change crisis, if we think about a covenant, some talk about the model covenant, some talk about the donor economy, to give an example. So, in my point of view, one of the biggest problems we have is the intermittent or infrequent policy, that there is always a new beginning when there is a change of management. That happens a lot in our country. Today we heard from Marcelo Sanchez Orondo. He's quite critical, and he's probably right. But these issues that we address are above the government's agenda interests, and they require state policy. We have to get rid of these intermittent patterns, and that would be a condition required to have a new covenant between humans and the planet to ensure the nature of SDGs. 5 years of SDGs have gone by from the Agenda 2030 and the COP21, and we still wonder where we still have to think about the objective we like the most, or the polyhedric convention. So if we are going to talk about the future, and that involves a new covenant between humans and the planet, in your opinion, what would be, you don't need to come up with a specific universal answer, what would be a line of action? I don't know if I have answered your question.
Yeah. So I would first challenge the notion of a covenant between people and the environment, or people and the globe, or people and the planet, because when you talk about a covenant, it's supposed to be an agreement between two groups or two entities where there's obligations on both sides. And to try to obligate the planet, to try to obligate nature, I think that's something that I think we really have to think about. What does that could that really mean? Now, I've talked about the idea of giving legal personality to natural resources, to water, to glaciers, and so on. But I'm not quite sure that's the same thing to put them in a covenant. I would actually say that the covenant has to be with us. We have to have a covenant with ourselves that we're going to require ourselves to do certain things, and then we can expect ourselves to have certain benefits that we can enjoy. The globe, the planet, the environment around us, it's going to operate in a certain way. We can influence it, we can affect it, but it's not going to respond in and of itself. It will react. It will not respond. It will react. And so I think it's the responsibility of people to have a covenant with themselves, with our governments, with our local communities, with our corporations, and so on, to act in a certain way, be more responsible, take care of what is around us, take care of our surroundings. When we have a covenant, we can have a covenant with, I guess, with the planet. But that to me becomes a one-way obligation. What we promise to do to ensure that we have a planet, that we ensure that the planet survives. Now, survives for us, yes. But again, the planet doesn't respond. It reacts. Because we push, it's going to push in a different direction, because that's just the nature of nature. It will not respond of its own accord to say, oh, humans, you're so wonderful, let me give you this benefit now. That benefit will come if we react in a certain way to the planet and protect the planet. So the notion of a covenant, I think it has to be structured very carefully and implemented in a way that really recognizes the fact that people have to make decisions, and people are the ones who have to have these responsibilities. And when I say people, I mean people at the lowest level, at communities, in governments, in corporations, at the international level, and so on.
It's a very philosophical question, but I think as a Catholic and an avowed fan of Pope Francis, for me, it's quite clear that we have to recognize the planetary boundaries to come to any kind of agreement. That has to be a starting point. We have to accept and understand and respect that the resources can only go so far, that the planet can only go so far, that we have already outstretched. We've gone way beyond our credit on how we're supposed to behave with this planet. So we have to have a certain level of recognition first that we can't really adjust from here in the best way. We actually have to rethink the way we're operating. And all of our systems are functioning in a growth paradigm, of just more. And everything is built around that. So we actually have to rethink that and deconstruct that if we want to live safely and soundly and happily on this planet. We have to, and again, going back to what some of the other speakers said, question what we value. What do we value? If we value life, if we value flourishing, we value peace. This is very different from valuing material wealth and accumulation and utilitarian relationships between humans and with resources, with nature. So it really is a new, I wouldn't call it a covenant in the legal sense, but in a sense it is a new, it's a new stance to take. We have to rethink our own humanity and our own, what is our dignity about? And our dignity is about also respecting the dignity of the earth we're sharing.
Thank you very much, Josiane. Enrique, your remarks to be closing off this panel. Well, I'm perhaps more pragmatic as I have been leading the mayor's office, and I know what has to do with water and sanitation that is put in place in the state territories. And when we say that there is no agenda, because politics define the agenda based on social controls, and what we lack is awareness raising. What causes the lack of water or the non-authorization of the adequate use of water. From Argentina, and if we compare, I can say that if we don't have a binding regulation system, if a country commits itself and undersigns agreements with international agreements, we'll get to Agenda 2030 with sanitation, environmental protection, and access to safe water. That boils down to a budget. Just like in Argentina, we need roughly $22,000 million to reach 100% water coverage. What matters is that each country commits to an action plan geared towards that goal. And international funding has to be breached with this binding regulation, so that for a country through multilateral organizations can have a regulation regarding water and sanitation, there should be an investment plan that can be done in the provinces that seek funding or they want to establish state policies for water and sanitation. And this is applicable to municipalities too. Here in this entity, we can see all the municipalities' representatives. And the first question they ask is, what is the importance of water and sanitation in your budget? So I think this is a way to make it a required condition to have access to certain benefits. The regulation should be binding. And that way we'll be able to get rid of asymmetries. When a mayor does not have access to a funding source to build a road or for urban improvement, because they fail to comply with water and sanitation policies, there is going to be social aggression. And this is going to be included on the agenda. I think that would be the path to follow. Thank you very much, Enrique. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Josiane. The attendees' knowledge provides us with a new epistemological knowledge and shows us the path to follow. So I want to thank all the attendees for being here, and let us remember that this forum is organized along with REPAM, and we will have a new meeting on September the 17th. Wish you all a good week, and let us meet again on next forum. Bye-bye. Thank you.